All right, hopefully you've had a chance to practice some of your PHP basics. Now we're going to get a bit more advanced and talk about the PHP coding standards. You could get to the link for the PHP coding standards in the WordPress handbook from the lesson notes. And just to show you a bit what we have here, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. Notice that there are several coding standards. There's HTML, accessibility, CSS, JavaScript, as well as inline standards. So we're looking at the PHP coding standards, but in general, it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with all of this. So let's break it down and start going through this. Notice that it starts off talking here about single and double quotes. It says, notice that if you're not evaluating anything in the string, so if you're not passing a variable, go ahead and use single quotes. And you should never have to escape things because you could just change your style. So rather than having to escape some double characters here by using double characters at the beginning, notice if you know you're going to use, double, and I'll just zoom in a bit here. If you're going to use double quotation marks, then inside of your string, then start with a single. If you're going to use single ones inside of your string, then start with a double. So that's all it's saying. Just go back and forth. So indentation is another really big one. WordPress is all about readability. So it says use real tabs, not spaces, as this allows most flexibility. And notice how this is all nice and cleanly lined up. So that's a general good rule of thumb, that you want some white spaces and you want things lined up. Now in PHP, it is possible to write things on one line in some PHP statements. So you could end up with some blocks that aren't wrapped in these curly brackets, but in general, you want to use them just to make your code cleaner. So right here, this would not be required since it's just one line in an if statement to have these curly braces, but it makes it cleaner. So they're saying, go ahead and do it. Notice that we have else if versus else space if, some regular expression hand stuff, and no shorthand PHP tag. So anytime we write PHP, it's got to go inside a PHP block, which is opened like this. This is a PHP block right here. Now, some servers have some extra code so that you don't have to write PHP. You could just do this or the equal sign, and that will automatically echo something. Now, because this works on some servers and not on other servers, in general, they say always just stick to this so that your code is as usable across the board as possible. Try not to have trailing white spaces. And some things here like there does not have to be a space between the X and the double equal sign or the 23, or between the two ampersands, in between commas here in the array, or in between here. All of this can be compressed with no white spaces, but it makes it really hard to read. So basically, anytime you're doing anything like this, notice how much white space is here, and they call it breathability for your code. So that's a good idea, just to add those extra white spaces in there. However, notice in some places it says, hey, in this case, you don't need to have them, but if it's a variable name, then you do. So again, take the time to read through this. Not all of it will make sense, but as you learn more WordPress and more PHP, you could come back and read this again, and it will begin to make even more sense. So naming conventions, moving along here, when we name a function, so display title, display post, name in lowercase underscore to separate. So there's camel case that is possible in some languages, but WordPress likes you to stick with this naming convention. If you have a class, we won't really look at this too much until much later in the course, but that's going to have uppercase. Constants, things that don't change, are going to be all caps. File names should all be lowercase with spaces between them. And if it's a class, it should start with that. And then this is just a kind of core thing, how to name internal core files. This is just talking about trying to name things in a way so that if you're naming them, or if they have true and false values, they actually make sense. So whether something's slow or not, true or false, that makes sense. Whether something's mushrooms or dog food, that could be a little bit confusing. So just talking about naming things, a little bit more on naming. Again, this is stuff that some of this won't even really be that valuable to you. There's some complicated ways of writing if statements. Some people say simpler, but some of the stuff you'll come back to, some of it can be helpful. For example, one of the things they say to write are what called Yoda conditionals. And what this is putting the test value before what it is that you're trying to test. So normally you'd say, if the force is equal to true, then go ahead and do this. However, the problem with that is that if you forget the equal sign, you could accidentally set the force equal to true, which would be a problem. So you can't set the force, you can't override the true value here. So it's just a safer way of doing it. Some people think it's a little awkward. They call it Yoda because if true, the force is victorious you will be. It sounds kind of like the way he speaks of flipping things around, but this is a WordPress standard, so helpful. And I'll show you this again and again throughout the course, so you don't need to worry about it too much. They talk about clever code versus readability. So oftentimes folks will come back and say, hey, you could have done this in one line by doing this, this, and this. But in general, WordPress likes things spread out easier a little bit more, talking about documenting, and now we're at the bottom. Okay, so that is the WordPress coding standards. Your homework is going to be to read through all of this, skimming where things don't make sense and trying to understand what does make sense.